Hi, folks. This is a continuation of our module on Vietnam and conservatism. Here in part two, we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of the Vietnam War and the way that it was fought. Because as I mentioned at the start of this unit, Vietnam is really qualitatively different from previous conflicts that the U.S. had been involved in. It's not just a conventional fight against North Vietnamese troops. It's also an insurgency. So there's really kind of two wars going on simultaneously within South Vietnam. On the one hand, you do have a conventional war. So you have North Vietnamese professional troops, raised by the nation of North Vietnam. They are trying to invade from the north into the south. So you have this kind of conventional threat. But then there's also an insurgency. This was called the Viet Cong. These were people within South Vietnam who supported the communist side. They did not support the South Vietnamese democratic government. They wanted to overthrow that democratic government and replace it with rule by Ho Chi Minh and the communists. And so they were working from within to try to overthrow their own government from the inside. And they were using guerrilla tactics. So using terrorism, political assassinations, just harassing effective leaders, just generally doing everything they could to try to destabilize the South Vietnamese government from the inside. And we'll see here in a moment that this is really problematic because you can't always tell who is the friend and who is the enemy. These are all South Vietnamese citizens. Some of them support the democratic side, their own government. Some of them are Viet Cong. And it's hard to tell who's who. And so we'll see that really becomes a problem for the American war effort down the road. But the key thing to take away here is that there is this conventional fight against regular troops, but then there's also this insurgency, this internal threat that is really difficult to pinpoint and to identify. In the early 60s, the US was really committed to supporting the democratic government in South Vietnam. Again, that fear of the domino theory. But with Diem's assassination and a mounting Viet Cong insurgency, the situation in South Vietnam is deteriorating pretty quickly. When Lyndon Johnson becomes president after Kennedy is shot in 1963, he's warned by his advisors that South Vietnam is in danger of being taken over by the communist side if he doesn't do something soon. So that's how dire the situation has become, and just how much support the communists have managed to build within South Vietnam, that they're on the brink of being able to just take over. Well, Johnson, he's got a very ambitious domestic agenda that he wants to pursue. He's going to need all the political support that he can pull together to do that. He can't afford to look weak on communism. And so given these warnings that South Vietnam is kind of teetering on the brink, Johnson believes that he needs to take action here and prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism. So in 1964, Johnson is going to start to escalate the war. And this came in response to a specific situation that happened that summer. In August of 1964, a couple of US warships were patrolling off the coast of North Vietnam. And they report that they have been fired upon by North Vietnamese troops. They've had torpedoes fired at them. Well, Johnson says, this is an act of aggression. We can't just stand by and do nothing while our troops are being attacked. He goes to Congress and asks for permission to respond, and Congress gives it to him with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And I should point out that this was passed almost unanimously. The vote on this was like 500 and something to 2 or something just insanely ridiculous like that. This gave Johnson basically a blank check. It gave him open-ended authority to, quote, take all necessary measures to repel this kind of armed aggression from the communist side. So Congress is essentially telling Johnson, you do whatever you think you need to do to fight this war, and Congress is going to stay out of your way. Congress is essentially ceding a lot of their oversight and a lot of their kind of input over the military to the president. They're putting a great deal of power in the president's hands here to conduct war. And yet this is not a declaration of war. In fact, the US never declares war on North Vietnam. So this is a huge escalation of the war itself, as well as the president's power to conduct war, but it's not actually a formal declaration. Well, Johnson is going to use this authorization to ramp up American involvement. He's going to launch a large-scale bombing campaign of North Vietnam, including not just conventional weapons, but chemical agents, things like napalm and Agent Orange. And the whole purpose of this massive bombing campaign was essentially to try to bomb the North Vietnamese into submission, to inflict so much damage and destruction on the enemy that he reaches a point where he just can't take it anymore, and he decides to quit and throw in the towel. So the thinking was that we could use air power to put that kind of pressure on the enemy to make him decide to give up. Johnson is also going to start sending ground troops into South Vietnam, and the numbers of these troops increase pretty quickly. By 1969, there's over 500,000 US soldiers serving in South Vietnam. And for the guys serving in Vietnam, many of them were children of World War II veterans, maybe even Korean War veterans. But what they find is that this is a very different kind of war than what World War II was. These are kids who'd grown up, hearing stories from their fathers and their uncles about what World War II was like, fighting the Nazis, fighting the Japanese, seeing John Wayne movies where John Wayne is, storming the beaches at Iwo Jima, that sort of thing. That's what they expect war to be like. They expect it to be clear-cut. You know who the enemy is. You know what your purpose is. And it's a noble purpose. There's honor in it. Early on, a lot of these guys were volunteers. So they willingly enlisted because they believed what the government was telling them, that we needed to fight against the spread of communism in Asia, because if we don't stop it there, it could potentially spread and threaten our own shores. A lot of these men believe that. As the war goes on, though, many of these men start to question whether that is really the case, and we start to see that more and more of these soldiers are not volunteers, but rather draftees. Oftentimes, guys getting drafted straight out of high school. If the guy in this slide looks kind of young, it's because he probably is. The average age of a GI soldier in Vietnam is about 19. In World War II, the average age of an American soldier was about 26. So this is a significantly younger fighting force. And the reason this matters is because you have to realize that at the time, the voting age was still 21. So many of these men are being drafted and sent to fight in a war, but they can't actually vote for the leaders who are sending them there. This is a big disconnect. It's one of the reasons why the voting age gets lowered to 18 in the early 70s. So over time, more and more of these guys are being drafted. What we also see is just that the makeup of the fighting force is significantly different too. It's not really representative of America as a whole. What we see, particularly in combat units, is that these are disproportionately poor, working class, and minority men. Something like 80% of the enlisted ranks are coming from these poor, working class, minority groups. Again, oftentimes these are guys straight out of high school. Now, by contrast, middle class men, people who are a little bit better off, they can afford to go to college and get college deferments that will keep them out of military service, or at least maybe keep them out of frontline assignments. They may have the education and the skills that will get them into an assignment as a clerk at headquarters or something like that, rather than being, a frontline grunt who's going to get sent out into the bush to get his ass shot off. So there's a big kind of class and racial disparity here, particularly in the men who are doing the actual fighting on the ground. And just the way that the war is being fought is different than what America had done in previous fights. This is an insurgency. So the enemy can be difficult to identify because the enemy is potentially all around you. Some of these South Vietnamese citizens are on your side, but some of them are Viet Cong. And you can't always tell. When you walk into a village, they may be smiling at you when you walk in and shooting at you as you walk out. So given that it's hard to differentiate between who's the friend and who's the foe, a lot of times these soldiers are going to shoot first and ask questions later, just as a way of self-preservation, protecting themselves and their unit. Because it's not always clear who the real threat is. In extreme cases, this can even lead to targeting civilians. And I think probably the most notorious example of this would be at My Lai. This was an instance where an American company actually massacred an entire Vietnamese village, roughly 500 men, women, and children. The other issue that kind of complicates this is that the tactics here are different too. In World War II, the plan was to invade and conquer and occupy Germany, capture Berlin, and that's how you were going to force the Nazis to their knees. That's not the case in Vietnam. The strategy here is not to conquer and then occupy territory. You're fighting an insurgency. You're trying to prevent a communist takeover. So the goal here was to locate those communist insurgents and kill them. They were going out on search and destroy patrols out into the countryside, find the enemy, kill him, inflict a whole lot of damage on the other side, because that's how you make him want to give up. It wasn't about capturing territory. The measure of victory in Vietnam was the body count. The number of dead enemy fighters you have to show is an indication of whether you're winning the war or not. Well, think about that in combination with the fact that it's not always clear who the real enemy is. And you can see there's a real potential here for some psychological issues for many of these soldiers, particularly when they come home and have to kind of cope with what they've been through.